This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again Professor Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck. Nice to have you with us again. Now, you're a man of many parts, but I would say you're a constitutional scholar. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I
studied
try,
the
yes.
Constitution. You understand?
I've been studying this 4-page document for my entire adult life, and I still don't understand it, but I keep trying.
There's a lot in it, and our country continues to have constitutional questions that trouble the national psyche. And one of those events that have taken place is the Supreme Court, making the opinion that gay marriage is a constitutional right, and that it's a privilege that can't be denied. Marriage is a part of life, and to deny that to a person because of their sexual orientation is against our principles, and ergo that needs to take place. And there's been a recent collision in a rural county in Kentucky where presumably a nice lady, seems to be a nice lady, who is a fundamentalist Christian, as I understand it, and is in charge of issuing marriage license in that rural county. And she believes that to do so would be against her religious principles, and she believes it's God's will and law that she not do this, and is willing to face whatever consequences that will happen to her. She's going to accept that. Yes. And there's this juggernaut of, legal hell coming her way from every source. And so she's really, you could say, going to be stoned. And it's in a situation where the courts have out of the blue created this right, which most Americans would have been against 20 years ago. And their opinions have changed, things have shifted, there's a whole other dynamics there. And how does one parse this out? I mean, what should we do to try and understand this collision of ideals?
Yes. Well, I think the thing that we have to start with is this very simplistic phrase, separation of church and state, which most people, I think, misunderstand. And it's simplistic because it doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution. Now, religion does appear in the Constitution. There are 3 main places. The religious test clause of the original Constitution that says that there can be no religious test for holding public office. So you can't be barred from holding office because you're an atheist, or for that matter, because you're a Christian. This is just something that we're going to stay hands-off.
Which was the case in England at that
yes.
time. You couldn't go to Oxford, you couldn't go to Cambridge, you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that unless you were an Anglican.
Correct. Then you have in the Bill of Rights, added very soon after the Constitution went into effect, the first 2 provisions of the Bill of Rights, of the First Amendment, that tells you how seriously people took this. The Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Now, of course, in that case, does the word establishment, is it a noun or is it a verb? Mm-hmm. Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Mm-hmm. So those are the 3 clauses, the Religious Test Clause, the Establishment Clause, and the Free Exercise Clause. There
yes.
is no separation of church and state clause.
Yes.
So what you've got here is a woman who has been elected to public office. She was elected to this office before the Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage.
Yes.
And she is claiming in the exercise of her official duties that she is attempting to exercise her religion freely
yes.
in accordance with the First Amendment.
Yes.
Now, you can come back in several ways with that. One
yes.
is that, I think the first one is that by doing this, if we let her do this, is this an establishment of religion that the government, the government agency of which she is a part, is making a decision based on religious principles and making that, if you will, the official position of her office.
Yes.
So you start to see how difficult
Yes.
this becomes. And then we throw in the equality added much later by the 14th Amendment, which is not actually the basis for Justice Kennedy's opinion. Everyone thought it would be.
Yes.
That no state shall deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So a gay and lesbian couple or a gay or lesbian individual
yes.
should have the same right to marry as
Yes.
a straight
Yes.
individual or
Sure.
straight couple.
Well, now that's rather complicated, isn't it? So we get into the question. So as I take your analysis, there is one's moral compass is not particularly protected, as I understand this. If you say my moral compass is the government wants me to, I don't know, do anything, throw children in the fire, or injure little squirrels, or do whatever they want to, it's the government policy to do that, and I'm not going to do it, and you can do anything you want to me, but this is immoral, and it goes against my perception of God's law, which is a higher law than the law of the state, and ergo, I will not do this. And so, but that seems to be an issue, isn't it? So what happens when you could make the case, the assumption is in a democratic system that the people in the democratic system are moral good people, and they're going to make moral good laws that comport with, you could say, divine law. So there's no difference between the two. There'd just be a refinement of divine law. That's what secular law would do. But if the two don't, if the secular law is against moral law, a person says, well, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be punished. Where are we headed under those circumstances? I mean, if the state, and the other point that's important in this is that if the democratic process did not directly accomplish this, but it was only at a tremendous distance from popular will, although popular will would seem to go that way, it was at a tremendous distance and accomplished by just a few judges with limited exposure to the world, living in New York City, et cetera, and this is the popular liberal viewpoint, and we're just going to enforce it on 320 million people, and we're going to run across contrary moral convictions. And I'm not sure that when the countries faced this in the past, they've been accommodative, I would say, to a person with strong moral, religious convictions. They generally would say, okay, we're going to find an out clause for you.
Yes. And as a matter, it's interesting you should, if I can interject, it's interesting you should use that word because in the mid-1980s, there actually was a case, a free exercise in an establishment, actually it was an establishment case, in which the court actually came up with a doctrine called accommodation.
Yes.
The case was Lynch versus Donnelly.
Yes.
And the question is, what happens if, I believe it was Pawtucket, Rhode Island, that wanted a manger scene on the courthouse grounds.
Right.
And the majority of the Supreme Court in that case said, yes, we cannot allow an establishment of religion, but we have to accommodate little bitty things like this. This is not a big deal.
Yes.
Which, well, some people said it was a big deal.
Yes.
But just an aside there.
Yes. Well, it must have had a similar, nexus somehow.
Yes.
Well, all right. So just going into that, it would appear that if the person is claiming religious, under the rubric of the Constitution, but shaky, on the other hand, we're really cutting to the fabric of the country. Is the idea, and this is an important issue, the American identity is, in my opinion, founded on the idea that it's a moral country. We can all sort of rally around the flag on that point. We have people, diverse viewpoints, diverse whatever. If there's a national religion, if there is one, it would be we're all going to try and behave in a moral fashion. We're all going to try and do the right thing. We're not going to be selfish. We're not going to loot, I don't know, Mexico and steal their money, and we'd always be a nice a nice
Although
country.
we actually did that once. But
We certainly did do it
yes.
once. We certainly did do it once, which brings up another point. That's the ideal. Now,
And we lived up to it, yes.
So yes, and so many people would say that's your ideals, but you've never responded that way in your whole history. But if you never have, you could go slavery, you could say Indians, you could say all the awful things that have happened. You could say that, but the mythology is that it's a moral country, and we depend on that idea. And yet, if a person is saying, I'm a moral person, and then people agree, yes, you are a moral person, we can believe that. Your life has been blameless, we respect your viewpoints, and you're not going to go along with a new arrangement the Supreme Court has fostered upon you that's contrary to all kinds of tradition and viewpoints in I guess, rural America, and also urban America to some degree. So how does that resolve? How is that going to be resolved if the legal system pushes too hard on her? That'll have a pretty negative impact on in my opinion. But
well, let me give you another model here. Instead of acknowledging that yes, this is a moral person who is trying to do the right thing as she has been given the right to do it, what if we have another script to this story? This is not a moral person. She is an evil person. The law is perfectly clear. The highest court in the land has decreed what must be, and she is being petty and intolerant and obstructionist, and this cannot be allowed. She's not moral at all. She's trying to force her narrow, bigoted view of the world on us.
So we get into, a complicated. Now I'm glad you took the conversation in this direction, Bucky, because this is where I was going with it. And the idea is that you have different sets of moral viewpoints, and if you have a very diverse country, there are a lot of people. Let's see, the Islamic people. They've got their law of the book or whatever. They've got their own sort of legal code. Many people do, and this is right. We stone adulterers. We do this. We do that. Honor killings. This is what we believe is strongly moral, and we have a very diverse country. The tensions just ratchet up, don't they?
Yes.
And this is so we're seeing the ratcheting up of tension in this situation, with it's sort of a penalty of diversity, if you want to say that. The idea is that diversity causes lots of new, good restaurants. I like that. I think it's great. You get people, nice people from everywhere. You can learn things. They've got viewpoints. They make big contributions. But if we don't have some kind of, I guess, common moral viewpoint, then we have these devastating collisions that threaten the sort of cohesion of the country.
Well, this is why the modern celebration of diversity, I think, is absolutely naive, because when many people, I think when the majority of people use the term diversity today in this culture, as the old line goes, I do not think that word means what they think it means. The best I've heard it described is many, many times in my experience, when I hear someone talking about the importance of diversity, it is a very superficial thing with them. That, as I've heard it described, that they want the world or America or the community to look like the United Nations, but to think like a Berkeley coffee house.
Yes.
They don't want true diversity means very serious conflict of very basic worldviews. And if you're going to have that, you have to have a process for hearing all of these views expressed and then deciding of which one of these is going to prevail in a given circumstance. Whereas most people today, when they think diversity, it comes out to some sort of kumbaya fest where we all basically agree. Well, we don't, and that's just the way it is.
So, actually we're getting into really, I think, complicated event, or complicated, this particular collision represents a very complicated, I guess, passage of our nation.
It's true diversity, and that's the problem.
The idea is you have a melting pot. So you could start out with what's the viewpoint of America, what is it? Well, there are sort of English peasants or British peasants or maybe Northern European peasants that were given this paradise, and they have all these moral viewpoints. They become sort of raised up, and they dominate everything. That's at least the concept. and they have no lord over them. The king is not over them. They're just lords themselves.
Yes.
I mean, you could say Tocqueville going through Tennessee. There's a great passage. There's sort of an oafish guy there with 4,000 acres, and just he's sort of a quite oafish guy. But a king in that, a little king in that area. And then the country changes. We have all these huge different people coming from everywhere, and particularly after 1965, the whole idea is this tremendous change and alteration of the makeup of the country, and people from everywhere with all kinds of great people, many of them, diverse ideas, this, that, in the country. And the question is, can they melt together? Can you melt all of these 320 million people into a nation that has a similar moral viewpoint, and then the country would work a lot better. But if we have 25 different kinds of moral viewpoints, then we're going to have all kinds of problems, aren't we?
Yes. And I think one of the basic problems is that you alluded to briefly a few minutes ago, and we've talked about this at greater length before. If you look at, for instance, the Supreme Court, the 9 justices there represent a very narrow slice of the many different diverse cultures that we have. Most of them are Ivy League, they're East Coast, they're urban. And if that goes too far, if one of the groups or even a small number of the groups get a disproportionate voice, and therefore the rest of the country feels somehow disenfranchised, I think the thing that is most likely to result in serious crises is if a sizable part of the public or a sizable number of the interest groups feel that the game is rigged somehow, that the deck has been stacked against them. And you can see this in other contexts. The Ferguson riots, when it was pretty clear, even though it was a clean shoot in the Walker case, there was pretty clearly some ongoing systemic racism within the PD there. And so I think it's very natural to say, the deck is stacked against us. This is a rigged game, and therefore you have to go back to that old adage of Smith and Wesson beats 4 aces. Is this where we're headed if you get this kind of problem?
Well, just to go through this, I mean, as we look at this dilemma, the national dilemma here, you made an important point, I think, earlier when you discussed the Constitution, the idea that it started out, I mean, sort of use your phrase, of liberty. So the initial viewpoint was the rights are enumerated, and the idea is you can do whatever you want, pretty much, and there's going to be you're going to be on your own. If you bump up against someone, well, that's okay. The nation is not going to stop you from having sharp elbows because you're exercising your liberty, and presumably the person you've bumped up against with your elbow will respond in kind, but the nation would not interfere with that. And the quid pro quo of this whole thing is that there would be to use another word, diversity of power and circumstance. So there would be enormous inequality. There would be. If you have total liberty, people can do what they want to. You could imagine in a state of nature, some people would grow to be big dogs, and some people would be little dogs, possibly the big dog stepping on them a lot.
And we know what Hobbes had to say about how that ends up.
Yes. So we have this arrangement, and so after the 14th Amendment, the idea is the courts are going to interfere with that system, interfere with liberty, to establish equality, meaning they're going to restrain the big dogs at every chance they get to protect the little dogs. And in this case, the courts, a narrow group of people, their perception of the country, the type of country they want, is they want the former big dogs, meaning people that have traditional viewpoints in rural areas, to back down. And and anybody they've elbowed, they can't do that anymore. And the whole force of the power of the courts will do that. And their justification for doing it is their sort of moral viewpoints, which don't comport with other moral viewpoints. So we're having this collision of morality. And there seems to be more of a problem because the courts are demanding moral behavior,
Yes.
which is always a difficult thing. Moral behavior as they interpret moral behavior, and it's going into every interstices in American life, and the tensions and resentments, I think, could surface more than they have. I think we see a little bit of that in Mr. Trump's popularity,
Yes, yes.
some of what's going on. Well, any comments about that?
Yes, well, I think you've nailed it, that in a world of perfect liberty, there is almost certainly not going to be equality. In a world of perfect equality, there cannot be liberty. And ever since the passage of the 14th Amendment, the Constitution mandates both. So how do you figure this out? But the problem in this particular case is even more insidious than that. Because I said earlier, Justice Kennedy did not rest his opinion on the Equal Protection Clause, which I think most people were expecting. Instead, he rested it on the concept of substantive due process, which is a fancy pants way of saying we're going to do something because we want to. Now, they would never admit to that, but substantive due process has been a means used for at least 100 years and perhaps as much as 150 for the court to impose its own value judgments in a case when it can't find a good clause to do it otherwise. So substantive due process has been used to justify slavery in the Dred Scott case. It has been used to justify laissez-faire economics and to prevent the state from regulating the workplace in the Lochner decision of about 110 years ago. It's been used to a degree to say that a woman has got a right to an abortion, and now it's being used to say that it protects same-sex marriage. And so it's used all along the spectrum, from the most reactionary to the most cutting-edge, bleeding-edge liberal. And the only common denominator here is it commands the support of 5 justices who think it's a good idea. And this unwritten right that you cannot find anywhere in the Constitution is held up by the court as being superior to any of the written rights, like free exercise of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press.
Yes. And
that's what's making people profoundly unhappy with it.
Well, I think we're on an interesting subject here. I think about the French Revolution, and they had liberty, equality. You had another word there, which was fraternity.
Fraternité.
Right. So, fraternity. Okay, fraternité. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Nous allons porter, whatever. Former la baillantance, whatever it is. Nous allons, whatever. Okay. Marchand. Okay. We rattle a few French words off here. Okay. Well, in any event, the idea that you could have some sense of brotherhood that would overcome this, and that's something that maybe that's a solution to this quandary, is the idea of getting sort of a feeling that we're all in this together. And you can see where some of that brotherhood occurs. I would say this. Examples would be if there's a big national disaster, everybody gets together. Sometimes when there's a crisis, I mean, maybe I don't know, you could pick, maybe New Orleans is not a good example, but some kind of, maybe 9/11 is a good example. 9/11, everybody has a sense that we're all in this together. And regrettably, wars do that. You have wars, so people they're all sort of cleave together. If people imagine that they can support the war. World War II is a big example. Another thing that I think is useful are sports. I mean, I've been very impressed with how, let's say when you have your football team, whatever, the Falcons, I mean, I could name whatever. You could name the University of Georgia Bulldogs, whatever. But people sort of come together around the idea of some commonalities. There are a lot of things that bring people together. And maybe one of the purposes of government should be to try and put that fraternity in our system.
Yes.
And I guess it's difficult to do that under some, those are good reasons to do it. The problem that happens is that if people try and separate groups from each other, and they try and say, you're this, or you're that, or you're this, or you're that, and you're intrinsically an evil person because you're injuring me,
yes.
and politicians play on that. So I mean, that's a real difficult issue, isn't it? I mean,
it is, and it's, and I don't know where it ends. When you have not a great deal of diversity, if you have, for instance, Puritan Massachusetts in 1640,
Yes.
when practically everybody in that colony has come there because he is a Puritan, he's a dedicated Puritan,
Yes.
he wants to be there, he risked a great deal
Yes,
to
right.
be there. It's easy to find a commonality there.
Right.
It's easy to have participatory democracy there because everybody is more or less on the
Yes,
same
yes,
page.
yes.
They're all white, they're all coming from the same places
Right,
in England,
right.
they all have the same religious view.
Right.
But what happens when you have the diverse society? If you're challenging the most basic rules in the playbook,
Right.
what do? James Madison tried to make this diversity a strength
Yes.
by saying that the different factions will play off against each
Yes.
other and none of them will gain too much power and they'll balance each other out. But is that really the way it works out? Sometimes yes, sometimes not so much.
Yes. Well, I'm struck by people that are a couple of things. Number one is, I think when people espouse diversity, they need to understand it's a two-edged sword. And
Yes.
when diversity is used, it often means
Do it my way.
Well, what it means is this is my moral viewpoint, and you're from old America, you're from rural Kentucky. You're not in this game.
Yes.
So the diversity means Brooklyn. That's what we want here. We don't want, and so it's an exclusionary word.
Yes.
And it has a knife attached to
Yes.
it, and it's just passed off as a summa bonum, as
Yes.
a great thing. There's never any blowback on that, and I think we tried to discuss how diversity could cause substantial national, just touching the story a little bit, national tensions. I think that's an issue of consequence. The other thing that goes on is just to say that some of the absence of fraternity is that if you have a world where economics are driving things so powerfully and cognitive ability is so important, and getting your niche in the moneyed world, if you don't secure that niche, it's going to be terrible excesses of capitalism. So there's a lot of tension, that demagoguery that
Yes.
in my opinion, is being fed into that, and it's causing more, I guess, hatred. If you say it, the hatred is afoot out there,
Yes.
isn't it? You can see the tension in the country. We talked about the situation in Kentucky, the small case, but tension everywhere. Hate is
Yes.
really walking the streets,
Yes.
isn't it?
Well, I've got a major problem with Ann Coulter. Sometimes she makes good points, but I've got a real problem with her. But she said a couple of interesting things about this, that the progressives, if you will, have won the culture wars in the question of same-sex marriage and gay rights, but they haven't been content to win the culture wars. They're now going from house to house and shooting the survivors.
Yes.
And I think that's where we are here. Has there been a victory with good grace in the case of this Kentucky situation? Now, if I were a member of a gay or lesbian couple in that county,
Right.
and I couldn't get a marriage license,
Right.
I might have a very different perspective there. So I can see that. So
Yes, yes.
That brings us back to the question. As Rodney King said, can't we all just get along?
Yes.
Can't they have a beer summit?
Yes,
Can
right,
some
right, yes,
accommodation
yes,
be
yes,
made in
yes,
that county?
yes. That would seem to be a really important burden for politicians.
Yes.
Politicians need to do that. They need to focus on this sense of fraternity. They should be espousing that at every turn, and because we need to remember, change keeps going.
Yes.
This is whatever the progressive world is not the end of the world. There's some other creature is going to come in the door. We don't know what the creature is.
Well, the radical progressives of the 60s are the crazy reactionaries of today.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Bucky. Thank you. Had a good chat. Thanks.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.